Well, this is a bit of a change of pace, huh? The ice type in Pokemon is kinda bad, but it could be made better. Of course, there are some good ice Pokemon, but the type itself is very flawed. And Pokemon balance is actually something I think about a lot, but it's not something I see discussed, like, super often. I guess that might be because we don't really expect it. The last time we saw any major changes to type matchups was the introduction of Fairy type in Gen 6, and before that it was the changes made in the second generation. And at the time of making this video, I don't know what, if any, balance changes have been made in Sword and Shield, but I'm willing to bet that a significant buff to the ice type probably isn't one of them. If you play Pokemon competitively, or just a fan of the games, you're probably aware that the ice type is known for not being very good. Now don't get me wrong, I like the ice type, I like a lot of ice type Pokemon, but there's a lot going against it. The most glaring and obvious flaw of the ice type is its weaknesses and lack of resistances. Ice is hands down, without a doubt, the worst defensive type in the game. It resists only itself, and is weak to fighting, fire, rock, and steel. Sure, that ice resistance is useful enough, but 3 of the things it's weak to, fighting, fire, and rock, are all incredibly common offensive types. And since the introduction of Fairy, you even see steel coverage slightly more often. And if that wasn't bad enough, being weak to rock also means losing 25% of your HP from stealth rocks every time you switch in, or even worse for Articuno. But even with all that, ice is pretty good offensively, and there are a lot of strong Pokemon that are weak to ice. It's very useful to have ice moves for coverage, but luckily, or possibly unluckily, the vast majority of water Pokemon, which is the most common type in the game, get access to strong ice moves like Ice Beam, as do many other non-water Pokemon. But unlike the ice type, the water type is good defensively, has only 2 weaknesses, and also resists ice. Sure, ice Pokemon get the same type attack bonus from ice moves, but that also comes with the downside of being ice. There is currently only one ice-type Pokemon in Smogon's overused tier for Generation 7, and that would be Kyurem Black, a Pokemon whose stats look like this. That's a stat total of 700, and I believe that is the highest base stat total of any non-Mega Pokemon in that tier. But it's partially its mediocre physical move pool, along with the negatives of being an ice-type, that keep a Pokemon even with stats like that from being put into Ubers. There are good and decent ice-type Pokemon, of course. Kyurem is one of them. But just having the ice-type can be a detriment. An ice Pokemon can be good, but chances are it's not good primarily because it's ice. So, how do you make it better? Well, the most obvious answer is to give it some actual resistances. Resisting only one thing and having 4 weaknesses, it's just not cutting it. We would want to keep these new resistances as something that works with a type thematically, but also works when it comes to balancing of other types. I've occasionally seen people suggest that ice could resist grass and bug, and both of those would work thematically since plants and bugs tend to not like the cold, but if there are any 2 types that don't need to be made worse offensively, it's grass and bug. Maybe if we were redoing things from the ground up, but the way it is now, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm already mad enough that they made Fairy resist bug for no reason, but that's for another time. So I personally would make ice resist ground, water, and flying, bringing its total number of resistances up to 4. Offensively, ground is tied with fighting for being super effective against the most types, with 5. However, compared to fighting, which is resisted by 5 types and has no effect on ghost, ground is only resisted by 2 types and has no effect on flying. There are a lot of Pokemon that quad resist fighting, but only 3 fully evolved Pokemon that 4 times resist ground, none of which are particularly good. There's also an ability that makes Pokemon immune to ground, but the point still stands that not many things actually resist ground. And while ground Pokemon probably wouldn't stay in against an ice type, ground moves in general are very common and it would be a very useful resistance to have. Water and ice would both resist each other, making them the only types other than bug and fighting to do that. And it makes enough sense. And hey, with how common the water type is, resisting it certainly couldn't hurt. And for the last one, I went with flying. I know some would have said dragon, but with Fairy being immune to it now, I'm not so sure about that one. But for the flying type, I would like to include a little asterisk that a new resistance would come with the addition of new, good flying type moves. I could probably make that topic a whole video on its own, and hopefully the new games actually get some new flying type moves. But we've still got Pokemon from the first generation like Aerodactyl, Gyarados, and Dragonite that are all lacking good flying stab. They're all pretty much stuck with like Aerial Ace or Wing Attack, and Bounce for Gyarados, I guess. Just give them something. So anyway, these changes would mean Alolan Sandslash and Aurorus would now lose their weakness to ground and gain a 4 times resistance to flying. Mamoswine and Aurorus would lose their weakness to water. Abomasnow and Crabominable would lose their weakness to flying, and Abomasnow would now quad resist both water and ground. All water ice types would now 4 times resist water, and of course, all the other ice types would just gain 3 new resistances. But having these new resistances wouldn't suddenly make ice a good defensive type. In fact, it would still be pretty meh. But that's still a massive improvement over what it is now, and it would resist some of the most common moves in the game like Scald and Earthquake, so it can't be all that bad. But why stop at just resistances? Hail is also arguably the worst weather type. I mean, it does damage to non-ice type Pokemon, and it makes Blizzard always hit. And that's kinda it. I mean, I guess you have Aurora Veil now. And it wasn't even until Gen 7 that we got some kind of Swift Swim equivalent with Slush Rush. But there's one change so obvious that I don't know how they haven't done it. All the way back in Generation 4, they made it so that rock Pokemon get a 50% special defense boost in sandstorms. I don't know why, but they never did anything similar with Hail. I'd say make it raise the defense of all Ice-type Pokemon by 50%. And especially when rock, fighting, and steel moves tend to be more physical, that could be really useful. Imagine Avalugg in the Hail. That thing's barely taking a scratch from a physical move. But yeah, this one just seems kinda obvious to me. And it would give some much needed bulk to the Ice type and be a good buff for a pretty mediocre weather condition. So just looking at them, many fully evolved Ice-type Pokemon actually generally have pretty decent stats. In fact, the average stat total for fully evolved Ice types is higher than the majority of other types despite there not being very many Ice legendaries. Though as of the time I'm saying this, Ice is actually the rarest type in terms of numbers. But in Generation 6 and 7, they've actually buffed certain Pokemon stats. Usually minor things like 10 points here and there, but some Pokemon like Masquerain actually saw a stat total increase of 40, and that ain't nothing. I mean, there are some Ice Pokemon like Delibird and honestly Dugong that can't really be saved by just minor increases to their stats. In those cases, you'd probably want a new evolution. But there are some cases where I think stat buffs could be really useful. Now, of course, with Gen 8 kinda removing a lot of Pokemon, this might not be that relevant now, but it could be eventually. We're just talking in general for now. I think Glalie is really cool. Heh, cool, like ice, ha! But its base stats are incredibly underwhelming. It's just 80 in everything, so it doesn't exactly do anything particularly well. I would say buff its attack, special attack, and speed from 80 to 90. That would increase Glalie's regular stat total from 480 to 510. While these changes wouldn't be that beneficial to regular Glalie, it would be pretty huge for its Mega. That speed boost would increase Mega Glalie's base speed from 100 to 110, and that's really good. And of course, further increasing its attacking stats is pretty good too. But if Glalie is getting stat buffs, you probably want some for its split evolution counterpart. Unlike regular Glalie, Froslass on its own is actually pretty good, but I don't think anyone would be opposed to making it a little bit better. I'd say give it 10 more in its attack and 20 more in its special attack, increasing Froslass's attack from 80 to 90 and special attack from 80 to 100. And that would keep its stat total in line with Glalie, but pretty much it's just gonna let Froslass hit a little bit harder on the special side. And you combine that with new resistances, and it's looking pretty good for Froslass. Abomasnow is also a really neat Pokemon. I like it a lot, and it's also got a unique type. But that unique type isn't really doing it any favors defensively. And even if it would lose one of its weaknesses, Abomasnow would still have 6. I would say increase its special defense from 85 to 105, increasing its total base stats from 494 to 514. But Abomasnow also has the ability Snow Warning, which sets up the Hail, and that would automatically mean a 50% defense increase. So in addition to gaining more defense from the Hail, Abomasnow would also have a higher special defense stat in general. And on Mega Abomasnow, that would make it super bulky. So it would become like this super defensive, slow mixed attacker. Which it kinda already is, but now it would actually be like way better at it. And lastly, I would say increase Crabominable's terrible speed. It has a base speed of 43. That's so slow that even max speed Choice Scarf isn't really gonna help that much. But Crabominable actually has excellent offensive typing. It's just that defensively, it's kinda trash. If it was semi-fast, it could actually be sorta decent. Its pre-evolution Crabrawler actually has a higher speed stat at 63. There's really no reason for it to lose speed when it evolves. So just boost Crabominable's speed up to 73. So this way it would actually get a little bit higher. That definitely doesn't make it fast by any means, but that speed stat actually becomes semi-usable. And obviously enough, any Pokemon could benefit from increasing its stats, but these would just be a few examples of how it could be done to partially make some Pokemon better. And finally, let's talk about moves. Glaciate is a signature move of the legendary Pokemon Kyurem. It has a base power of 65. Why they gotta do Kyurem like that? Its base form is already weaker than Reshiram and Zekrom, and they gotta give it like this trash signature move? Okay, it's not even that bad, but all it is just a better version of Icy Wind. Only slightly. Increase it to at least 85 power. So that way it would be decently powerful and it would still reduce speed. Now there would actually be a reason to occasionally run it over Ice Beam. And why is Frost Breath only 90% accurate? It's a variation of the move Storm Throw, but Storm Throw has 100% accuracy. So I would say do the same thing with Frost Breath, and it would actually become a decent choice. Since it always crits, it bypasses stat boosts, and with the crit, it effectively has the same base power as Ice Beam. It just couldn't freeze. And you know what's weird? Aurorus currently can't learn Aurora Veil. I mean, it's like it's in the name. And that would certainly pair well with Aurorus' Snow Warning abilities, so give it Aurora Veil. And you know what's lame? Avalug's best attacking ice move is Avalanche. It doesn't even get Icicle Crash. In fact, Icicle Crash isn't really learnable by that many Pokemon at all. I'd say spread it around a little bit more. Maybe give it to Avalugg, Abomasnow, and Walrein, as well as all of their previous evolutions. I would also say let Avalugg get Ice Shard. A priority move on a Pokemon that slow is very useful. Now, moving away from actual ice moves, I think it would be cool to see Jynx get Quiver Dance. I mean, I would also like to see Jynx get an evolution, but I think Quiver Dance on its own would be a good buff. It's one of the best setup moves in the game, and it works well with Jynx's dancing kinda motif. Also, Glalie, a Pokemon whose body is literally made out of a rock, can only learn one rock-type move, and that's Rollout. I'd say give it Rock Slide and Stone Edge at the very least. I mean, it is made of a rock. And lastly, give Kyurem, particularly Kyurem Black, Ice Punch. Wooper gets Ice Punch. Ghastly gets Ice Punch. This thing doesn't get Ice Punch. Kyurem Black has that crazy attack stat, but it doesn't really get any good physical Ice Stab. And Ice Punch isn't even particularly powerful. Just let him have it. And yeah, those were just a bunch of little and not so little ways to make the Ice type better. It's a cool type. Heh, there's cool again, it's like cold. I mean, it's one of my 18 favorite types after all. Honestly, it's probably like top 5 maybe. But hey, this kinda came out of nowhere, huh? Pokemon is actually one of my favorite series of games, and I do play it vaguely competitively. I've had a lot of documents written about it that I've pretty much done just for fun, but I've also had a lot of people telling me I should kinda branch out. And I figure Pokemon is popular enough that there's bound to be crossover appeal with Team Fortress 2, which isn't going anywhere, by the way. There's too much I want to talk about in that game for that to ever happen. But don't be too surprised if there's other games sprinkled in there throughout. I do like these kind of more like analysis type videos and like fixing things, which is pretty much what I did in Team Fortress, so yeah, I think it works. I don't really know how popular this video will be, but hey, it was fun to make, and that's all that counts, right? But don't worry, we'll be back with our regularly scheduled programming, next time. And until then, peace out, dogs.